Hey guys, welcome to the coding portion of the ZotHacks front-end workshop. Right now I'm going to be going over specifically the sample code that we have in our repositories, kind of explore it a little bit, teach you guys how to clone a Git repository and get into it. The main key points is we're currently on the ZotHacks 2020 front-end repository. These links will be released to you when we open the workshops. Kind of everything that you use will be found here, and it'll kind of go in tandem with the ZotHacks 2020 backend repository. So hopefully it'll be pretty easy to navigate. So we're going to jump right into it. Right now we have a README that kind of defines the main two commands that we're going to be running with our information, and specifically we're going to be using the master branch. If you are not too familiar with Git, don't worry about it too much. The steps that we're going to be taking are pretty simple, and it shouldn't require too much pre-existing knowledge of the platform. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go and copy the URL. This kind of assumes you have Git installed, but that whole process is found online pretty easily. So we can go Git Clone, and you can also type in any extra URL you want afterwards here, but we're just going to clone it into ZotHacks 2020 frontend, and then we should be able to see it right here. So we're going to cd into ZotHacks 2020 frontend. And we'll see that we are currently on the master branch, which means it's updated to all the code specs that we have right here. The main command that we're going to be using first is yarn install. It's missing right here, but it'll be there when we start the release the videos. And what this does is it goes and installs all the external packages to the repository. So specifically the ones that I talked about in the last video, that's React.js, React Router, React Viz, Node Sass, Axios, and Framer Motion. These are all the things that it installs into a directory, and I'll kind of describe the project repository right now. So now that we have everything running, we can go and do yarn start. And this right here, our current development server is linked to our hosted URL for the backend. So this backend already exists. We can test it right here. We have the URL defined in the application, but specifically it refers to ZotHacks 2020 workshop.herokuapp.user. This is across all of them, so that way you don't have to set up your own local backend to run this front-end application. And we see that we have the first part of the application that we're going to be building, along with a little bit of a console right there. That goes and names 4 of the entities that are currently existing in the database. Right now, they're all my name and possibly my email, and then we have John Smith right here. This is kind of the only thing that you're going to be starting with, and we can play around up until the workshop or kind of explore the different parts, but this is the main thing that you guys will be working with. So let's jump right into the code, so that way we can kind of explore all of the code that we have here and talk a little bit about the different parts, because I think starting a React project can be a little scary at first. There's a lot of files and a lot of different things. So the first thing before we go and open up these different sections is, what did that yarn install do? Yarn install went and installed all of these project libraries. It seems like a lot, but it's actually a pretty lightweight repository code base, which includes all the different things like for managing JSON information to like the actual React libraries, different ones about like headers and optimizing CSS. All those different elements are installed in Node modules. You might see some memes that's like, Node modules is really big because this is something that you never keep locally. You'll always keep locally, but you'll never push it up to the repository. Next, going into some of the other files, we'll go over templates later. We have package.json. This will become important later when we get into deploying, but for right now, just think of it as a list of all the libraries that is going to be installed when we do the yarn install command. And then it also has the commands, so yarn start and yarn build. These are commands that tell React to start the local development server or build the project into something that we can deploy. Other things, we have the README right here, which talks a little bit about some information, and then the git ignore. This might be repeating the backend workshop, but the git ignore tells us what not to push to Git, specifically the .environment files, and then the .build files, and the node modules, because these are a lot of uniquely created files just for deployment or local development, and they don't really need to be run and pushed remotely because they undergo a lot of changes all the time. So let's jump into the project. If you haven't done web development before, this can be a good thing or a bad thing because it might seem very large as a project, but also you'll kind of be getting your first experience with React. So you'll have your first experience be with a library that handles a lot of these cases pretty well, and I think it'll actually encourage you kind of learning the process a little bit. So this is assuming that we've already talked about the library specifically. This is the app.js. This is the start of the project. We'll see that we have a lot of our dependency imports right here, like importing React, so it knows that this is a React component. We have the CSS, we have the global CSS, which is in globals right here. And then we also, have a little bit more CSS for the React visualization library, but don't worry too much about that. And we also have some components being imported from the routing, and then we also have another view. So right now the only view on the project is user list right here. Specifically, currently the base URL, which means at the current path, just / it'll return the user list. Let's say we wanted to change it, and we want to change this to be /users. What does that do to the application? It pretty much tells us that when we have just a base URL, there is nothing that's going to be rendered right here. If we had something that was like route and then the path was just /, it would render that because it's pretty much just like an if statement that says, if it's this path, we're going to render this. And this is kind of how we construct the URL that's dependent on views. So similarly, if we go and we put users right here, we will see that it populates with the data that it loads from the database, which means it's loading that component. Okay, so where do we want to move in next? Let's go take a look at some of the global variables. Here's some stuff that I keep on, and just moving forward, if you take a look at the top of the README, it references this HackUCI React template. This is something that I maintain to make sure that when you get started with a React project, it has a lot of this file structure predefined already. And I'll talk a little bit more about this file structure soon, but it pretty much instantiates some global files. It makes it easier to do some imports, a lot of like things that you would kind of generally always do when you start a project, but I kind of grouped it all together. So hopefully when you guys get started on projects, you kind of know where to go, and you can start building a really well-maintained code base right away, rather than having everything all over the place. And then there are also some helpful ones right here. Here's a little bit more specific for specific helper classes that we can attach onto any component. You can add anything here. What else? We have the general CSS for the app, and as well as importing the variables file. So we have a variables that stores like the colors and some spacing, specifically like left gradient and right gradient. These are the colors that we store there. So if we wanted to change them at any time, it'd be easy. And then this is of course imported into the main app.js file. So let's take a look at right here, this information right here. We can zoom it in to talk a little bit more. Right now we have components, containers, hooks, and views. What does that mean? It's a lot of different parts, but we can kind of separate every component of a React, like every element, into 4 main things. Views, let's consider that this is like a page. So, a view would be something that we fill in an entire view of a page. And this could be like a home screen, a settings screen, a data analytics screen. It can kind of be whatever you want, but we want to try to think of views as something that would take up the whole page. And specifically on this page, we have user list, which is the list of users. If we had like a stock view, which is something we'll be working on in the in-person workshop, we'll have user stock or stock view. So here we'll find the user list defined. And what is this index.js file? Index.js kind of just repackages and exports the different things in the files. So that way when we're in the app.js, we can have a much easier import rather than importing from the user list directory together. So rather than doing import user list from app/use/user list /user list, kind of groups all of that together so that way it's a little easier. And then if we had another view like home, we could put it right there. And it would clean up the code quite a bit. So that's part of the things that we use this React template for, because it cleans up and already predefines that structure. And if you feel like this is going too fast, don't worry. It's a lot of content to absorb. Just go and send some messages to the UCI Discord and ask some questions there, or feel free to pause the video and Google any terms that I explain. We'll have some resources all defined in the front-end workshop packages that kind of go and explain the different parts a little better. So let's jump right into it with looking at some of the other elements. So we have containers. Containers, I like to think of something that wraps something else. So we see that we have this little card area. Let's say we always wanted to have every card on the site have this rounded border and a little bit of a box shadow and be white background. We could set the card to wrap the children that it passes in. So that way we could kind of just always, rather than having a styled div, we could have a card, that has like a name or something right here. So, this kind of cleans it up, and it takes children, which pretty much means like subcomponents to the top level components as something. You can see that it's breaking right here because it's not imported. What else? So components will generally be the biggest directory that you have, just because components will be kind of specific instances of something. For this one, it's a little confusing because we have card and user card, but I like to think of user card as specifically a user-defined card. So, this is kind of a specific use case, not really wrapping anything, but it's just a card that takes in a user and then a number, like specifically the index to represent right here. And this thing will always kind of be the same. So, that's why we wanted to make it a component. This could also be like the nav bar. It could also be like a settings panel or a specific graph that you want to show. Kind of try to use components as something that kind of bundles in all the unique parts of your application. Okay, so jumping into the React portion, let's go a little more in depth to the actual code of the user list. I'm going to take a sip of water. Just give me 1 second. So here we have a component that has a lot of different parts, but as we explained already in the previous video, we have kind of starting up here, we're going to be importing useState and useEffect, and let's break down all the elements to this page. So we have useState and useEffect. useState we're using right here at the top level of the component to hold a list of users. Because this component, when we look at the view that it's returning, we want this user list to return a list of users. And kind of what does that mean? It means we want to get all of the users, and then we want to render a user card for each one. And how do we do that without repeating a lot of code? Because when we have users here, this could return one user, it could return 20, it could return 20 million. We kind of don't really know what could be in the database. So we want to build this component to kind of handle those cases. And what that means is that this user list is going to hold the users right here. And the process of us using this component is it's going to instantiate an empty array. Then what it's going to do is it's going to make a call to the backend API to get the users, and then it will render it. So that's kind of like a top level overview, but we can talk about the specific elements that get us to that point. First, we want to import some libraries, specifically Axios, so we can make the GET requests, and then also the card, because we want to render the cards with each user information. So we have the list of users up here that's instantiated to null. Why do we want to use null right there? Because we want to know that it hasn't actually pulled anything from the database. And this lets us kind of, if we ever want to see if we've actually pulled anything from the database or we just got an empty amount of users, we kind of know the difference between that elsewhere. Then right here, this useEffect right here pretty much means that we're going to run this function when the items in this array change. And because the item in the list of this array is just 0 and there's nothing in it, it means it's not really going to be watching for anything. So it will only call this function once. We could also attach this to a button or maybe like a user count or something. Anything that we'd want to reload the users, we would throw in this array. But for right now, we're only going to load it when the page loads, which pretty much means that if there are any new users populated into the database, our front end won't really know about that because it only loads it once. So after calling this function right here, it's going to go to the get user list function. The kind of elements that make up this function is it doesn't really have any parameters because it's only pulling one solid endpoint, and it has this async right here. What does this async mean? Kind of getting a little more into how JavaScript works is, when you think about like what a website is a website has to interact with a lot of different things at once, which pretty much means it doesn't really have the capacity to, when we want to load data, we can't really have the website wait until that's finished. So it kind of gives this idea of how do we load data when we know we won't get it immediately? Because when we're loading data, what are we doing? We're going to the servers and we're requesting information, and sending that information over the internet takes time. So we use this kind of concept as such as async, which means we're not going to render the users until it's been loaded. And this async lets us do in front of this async definition in front of the function lets us use this await syntax, which means that it kind of is going to wait. It's a little counterintuitive, but it kind of gets into like the philosophy of using promises, which run functions when these things are finished. But using async cleans it up quite a bit, because we can know that when this variable gets assigned, this function has finished its call. And this takes a little bit, not too long, but you can see that it takes like maybe 50 milliseconds to run. So we have the response. You can read up a little bit about response codes. So response codes right here, HTTP status codes, kind of correspond to different elements that different things that the database could return, or the backend could return. A 200 response means that the response was succeeded, and maybe a 202 is it connected. 305 or 306 means that like that code is no longer used. 300 means there could be more than one response and you need to pick. 400 can mean the API just blew up. It didn't really know how to handle our question. So this if statement right here says that if we have a correct response, we're going to set the users, and then we're going to print an error if it doesn't properly get it. This users.data.data kind of just unwraps the information, and to learn more, we can go in console.log. This is a huge thing that you'll probably be using a lot when you're developing. This pretty much means that it's going to print the data out in the console when it runs. So we can go here, and we see that it has status of 200, and then the data returns a data object. So, little odd syntax, but data.data gets this array, and then here is the array of the information that we have. You can kind of see that it corresponds to the ordering that we have right here with all the information of like the email and the favorite stock. So then what we can do is in this function, because we're returning this information, we can return a list of cards. And a little bit confusing syntax, but think of map as returning an object. This map returns an array, and what we can do is we can render an array of user cards here, just like how we would define it like this. This is kind of what it's doing. It's going and defining, it breaks because these have no values put into it, but this is essentially just rendering like an array of 4 cards. And this is how we go and we turn an array of something into a lot of things on the page, which is a very big reason why to use React, because you can see how just like rendering 4 cards is very little code compared to like default web development, which will kind of be going and changing the actual HTML code to include all this information. So let's dive a little deeper into here. Why do we want to use this card? Because it goes and it kind of abstracts a lot of the code right here. We don't really need to know how this card is built on the user list. We just kind of need to know, that there's a card there. And that's why we can pass in the user as a parameter, kind of like calling a function, when I talked about that in the front-end workshop. We can go and talk a little bit, or like, we use the information that comes in as this function call to kind of show, we want to show the number, and then we also want to show the user first name and last name, and then the user email and the favorite stock ID. So this is kind of how we pass, and we pretty much turn this card into a function. that returns some HTML elements that have this design, and the design is all defined in the respective CSS file for this user card. And that's honestly React. Like, we're trying to keep this sweet and short, but if you have any other questions, don't be afraid to explore the code base or ask any questions on Discord. But React will kind of follow this process of loading data, visualizing and mapping it to more components, and these components kind of get a little deeper. The user card could have its own icons that go to their own information. And your whole process as a developer will be kind of taking this website idea and splitting it into a lot of different parts, and then organizing those parts into components, which each have their own behaviors. And once you kind of get in that thinking of like how to distribute all of those elements, then it'll make your React development a lot smoother. And that kind of finishes it up. I'll throw some more helpful information into the deployment video on how to deploy this project. But if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out on the Discord, or message me, or check out the any of the GitHub links that are here to learn a little bit more. But thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next video.